we just got done with some letters to some angels of some churches. That was chapters 2 and 3 of Revelations, right? We had the letters to the angels of the 7 churches. I'll be honest with you, it only gets more confusing from here. Because those were at least fairly straightforward to understand because they were still directions, right? They were like, here's what you're doing right, here's what you're doing wrong, here's what you need to do differently or do better, here's what you need to fix. And because they were instructions, they weren't quite as encoded as the rest of Revelations is going to be from here on out. I mean, we did have some little pieces of symbolic imagery, you know, each address to each church started with some very symbolic way of describing Jesus, but it's still fairly straightforward, easy to understand stuff. Here's our jumping off point where it starts to get a lot more apocalyptic, a lot more metaphorical, a lot more of this mythical imagery stuff going on. So let's see if we can't decode it. For Mary and Satira, what we did say last time is that I was giving them the study guide that I had prepared, but the challenge was read it first and then refer to the study guide to challenge yourself to see what you would come up with as an interpretation. And that's for a couple of reasons. One is because that's just going to like get you practicing like how would I interpret this symbol knowing that this is some sort of symbolic imagery, right? Like how would I interpret that? But also because, you never know, you might come up with an idea, like just because it's on my sheet doesn't mean that it's the right interpretation, right? Some of these things I think are fairly clear. Some of these things just aren't. Like that was a question that I overheard as I was getting set up, right? Does Dustin know the answers to all these questions? The 7 spirits before the throne, I don't know if that's a reference to Isaiah or to Romans or to 7 archangels that were part of the sort of late Judaic, early Christian mythology that they don't show up in our Bible, but there is a mythos, to our religion that doesn't entirely get captured by the Bible. So I really don't know. I've got my own, if somebody asked me like, what do you think it is and why, I could come up with an answer, but there's not a right answer to that question. I mean, you could ask people with many more degrees and PhDs than I have, and they would come up with different answers. So, yeah. So chapter 4. Why don't we do it this way? How about we split this thing in half? And if somebody wants to read through verses 1 through 6, where 6 is kind of split, 6 is a 6a, 6b thing. Somebody wants to read that first thing through verse 6, and then somebody else wants to start with around the throne and read to the end. And then we can talk about what we just read and see what we come up with. How's that sound?
Sure.
All right. Anybody want to read the first part?
I can go ahead and start.
All right.
After this I looked, and there in heaven a door stood open. And the first voice, which I had heard speaking to me like a trumpet, said, "Come up here, and I will show you what must take place after this." At once I was in the Spirit, and there in heaven stood a throne with one seated on the throne. And the one seated there looked like jasper and carnelian, and around the throne is a rainbow that looks like an emerald. Around the throne are 24 thrones, and seated on the thrones are 24 elders dressed in white robes with golden crowns on their heads. Coming from the throne are flashes of lightning and rumbling and peals of thunder, and in front of the throne burn 7 flaming torches, which are the 7 spirits of God. And in front of the throne there is something like a sea of glass, like crystal. Around the throne...
No, I'm going to stop you there. We'll have somebody else pick up from there. What do we get so far?
A lot of numbers and a lot of precious gems.
Yeah. So one thing that
it also says I must show you what will happen in the future. Is what mine says. Come here and I will show you what must happen in the future.
So, which verse are you looking at?
In that first verse, I will show you what must take place after this.
4:1,
That's where you're
right at the end.
Mhm.
I will
The end of one.
come up here and I will show you what must take
Take
place.
place.
Must
Right.
happen in the future.
Right.
This is not very.
What must take place after this, yeah, so what's to come?
This
That's
is-
very much in
That's what I
keeping
saw.
with the apocalyptic imagery, right? That it's a revelation of what is hidden.
It's also a switch from earth to heaven.
Yeah, so these are all good things, right? So hopefully you all, like, I didn't record this, but that's a really big, and there in heaven a door stood open, right? So this is apocalyptic literature, right? Like, this is a revealing. This is, I am seeing into what is normally not visible, right? You remember that we said that the word apocalypse, it literally means to reveal what was hidden or to uncover what is secret. So there's that very clear indication that we are entering into the more apocalyptic portion of our reading, right? And just like Joe said, we've switched from an earthly focus to a heavenly focus. And that's part of that apocalyptic switch, right? We are looking through this door that is open into heaven. And yes,
My footnotes say the colors described are colors that appear in the breastplate of the high priest. So I suppose that emerald and carnelian and jasper.
right. I'm trying to think of where that is found in the Older Testament.
Oh, in the Old Testament?
Yeah.
Leviticus, they do everything in Leviticus, don't they?
So most of this, what refers back to the Old Testament?
So,
Like different
so
parts of
there's a
it?
lot of references going backwards, yeah. Where was the line of Aaron made priests officially? I think.
I would think we would do it.
No, not building the temple, it comes much earlier, much earlier. The dress code comes much earlier than the building of the temple.
Oh.
Building the temple is Solomon, and that's First Kings. It's gonna be Exodus or
It's
Numbers.
tabernacle, it's not the temple, we're talking, the tabernacle.
Right, the tabernacle.
Well, here are offerings for the tabernacle, or the table.
Well, first chapter in Ezekiel talks about the heavens being open, and Ezekiel could see visions of God. The heavens were open, so it's kind of the same.
Oh,
We're talking about, looking for the color code of the priest's robe.
Oh, here is the vestments for the priesthood. They make the sons, they shall use gold, blue, purple, and crimson yarns and fine linen. The ephod, I don't know what the ephod.
Yeah, that's the thing, that's the
Okay.
hanging breastplate deal.
Gold, blue, purple, and crimson yarn.
There you go. Where'd you find it? Exodus? Numbers.
Yeah, Exodus 28.
Alright.
Oh, where it says.
I found this,
Building the priests.
Exodus 24, which is describing the tabernacle, and there we have 12 pillars corresponding to the 12 tribes of Israel. That's Exodus 24, 4. And then Exodus 24:10, it talks about this vision that they had of God. Under his feet there was something like a pavement of sapphire stone, like the very heaven for clearness.
Okay, and then further on, they talk about the breastplate. You shall set in it 4 rows of stone, a row of carnelian, chrysolite, and emerald, second row turquoise, sapphire, and moonstone, and then jacinth, and agate, and amethyst,
There you go.
beryl, onyx, and jasper.
You found it. Other things about these first 6 verses.
24 and 7.
You know, there's 7 spirits of God.
So, like I said, remember that 7 represents completion, wholeness, sometimes divine judgment. 7 is the perfect number, right? The Lord rests on the 7th day. Like 7 is the number of harmony, and it's the number of God, really. So you'll find 7 a lot. 24, my guess is that we've probably added the 12 disciples to the 12 tribes of Israel. 12 is a super significant number by itself. 24 is a little unusual. Because like I just read when we had the tabernacle from Exodus 24, right, there were 12 pillars that held up the tent. And those represented the 12 tribes of Israel. Obviously the 12 tribes of Israel itself, right, which come from the 12 sons that Jacob had. And probably the reason why there were 12 disciples who were sort of set apart, right? Because Jesus had a lot of followers beyond those 12. But probably the reason why there were 12 disciples who were set apart as like the special followers, the like core group, is probably to reflect the 12 tribes of Israel. So I'm guessing with 24, that's why, I think 24 is more of a doubling of 12.
And my commentary basically says that the whole of the people of God somehow represented in heaven. And it basically mentioned the 12.
Yeah, I would, my guess is that it's 12 twice rather than 24, if that makes sense. That we're getting extra 12s. With the 24 thrones and 24 elders. Anything else stand out? Because I think the one that's critical there is just like you noted, Joe, the real shift in tone. That we're less earth focused and now more heaven focused. But there's a door that is open to heaven, so we are able to see what we cannot normally see, and that we are going to be told, these are the things that must take place. Here's what you get now. Here's what you get next.
Yeah, there's very much a dream-like quality in this.
Yeah, it's very, very vision.
Back into the strengths.
Yeah. Vision.
That come up here, my commentary basically kind of stressed that too, that is the revelation. He was invited to come through the door. He wasn't seeking to go through the door.
Right.
It was revealed to him to go through the door.
Right. Yeah.
So this is not something.
That's very insightful, right? He did not knock on the door, but the door opened for him. Yeah, and I, if you had this ahead of time, you could have looked up those references, but those were, what exactly do these 7 spirits represent? I'm not real sure exactly what they,
Isaiah, I think, are what? The Spirit of the Lord, wisdom, understanding, counsel, might, knowledge, and fear of the Lord.
Right.
And then Romans is the prophecy, ministry, teacher, exhorter, giver, leader.
Right. So are these? So this is.
They're kind of so different.
Right. They are different. So the reason why I made those connections is because that idea of spirit and spiritual gifts, right? In the early Christian church, this was a thing, was that the Spirit wrought people gifts, right? The Holy Spirit gives you your gifts. And so here are places where there's 7 sort of gifts or traits that could be said to come from God. Another one is that so you've all heard there are some archangels who actually get named in the Bible. Gabriel is in there, Michael's in there, but there are 7 archangels that that kind of come out of a mythology of late Judaism, early Christianity. Now, not all of whom are mentioned. I cannot remember. Raphael is one of them. There's Michael, there's Gabriel, there's something with an A, Azamael or something like that. Obviously, it's not part of my religious tradition, but That's another possibility, as this could be a reference to the 7 archangels. I think that's also likely because that sort of mythology of the 7 archangels would be more closely associated with apocalyptic writing and literature, because it kind of all goes back to that great cosmic battle, right? That's a major theme in all apocalyptic literature as a genre, is this great cosmic battle, and that's where you get a lot more of the discussion of these archangels. So it's basically like the generals of heaven commanding the forces of heaven in the great cosmic battle. So, yeah. All right, let's keep on going. Let's read the second half of this chapter. Okay, Martha's got it. Say, I can do it too.
Around the throne and on each side of the throne are 4 living creatures, full of eyes in front and behind. The first living creature like a lion, the second living creature like an ox, the third living creature with a face like a human face, and the fourth living creature like a flying eagle. And the 4 living creatures, each of them with 6 wings, are full of eyes all around and inside. Day and night, without ceasing, they sing, Holy, 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 and the Lord God Almighty, who was and is to come. And whenever the living creatures give glory and honor and thanks to the one who is seated on the throne, who lives forever and ever, and the 24 elders fall before the one who is seated on the throne, and worship the one who lives forever and ever. And they cast their crowns before the throne, singing, You are worthy, our Lord and God, to receive glory and honor and power, for you created all things, and by your will they existed and were created.
So, let's tackle some of these things. 4 living creatures full of eyes in front and behind, inside and outside. What are we symbolizing? Should be an easy one.
They can see all.
Right. Watchfulness, all-seeing, right? They're able to see everything that's going on everywhere all the time, right? That's pretty clear symbolism there, right? Eyes all the way around everywhere, inside and outside. How on earth John can even see that there are eyes inside, we don't know, right? This is part of our clue that this is some metaphorical apocalyptic imagery, because it's really difficult for you to see the things that are inside a creature. But he somehow has that insight. The first living creature like a lion, the second living creature like an ox, the third living creature with a face like a human face, and the fourth living creature like a flying eagle. 4 is a number that we find occasionally start popping up in the New Testament, especially in the later, some of the last books to be written in the New Testament, often representing the 4 Gospels. There are 4 animals. What is it? Eagle, ox.
Human and lion.
No, not in this. Like each of the Gospel writers got its own animal attached to it. I'd have to look it up. But that's, they don't actually match these creatures here. 4 Gospels, animals. Let's see what I come up with.
One commentary said the 4 living creatures represent all animal life going in constant crazy death.
So that's the one that I am more. Oh no, it is also the same. Man, lion, ox, and eagle are also. So that's another way that you can interpret it. Is that the 4 Gospels each got an animal? So this could represent the 4 Gospels and the 4 Gospel writers. That's a tradition that starts popping up. It's not one that you'll find much, because obviously, like John was fairly late to be written in our biblical canon. It was one of the last books of the New Testament to be written. And so, like, for instance, you won't find any references to that in the Gospels themselves, or there's Paul, because that was a tradition that hadn't started yet. We didn't even have a Gospel of John. So that's one way to interpret this, is that these 4 living creatures might represent the 4 Gospels or the 4 Gospel writers, where when you put them all together, you have the complete Gospel of Jesus Christ. Another way is what Joe said, which I have written down somewhere on the study guide, representing all life on earth, right? You have your predators, you have your prey, you have human beings, and the sky. So that's another way that we can interpret that. It says that they each have 6 wings, which is a pretty clear reference to the vision that Isaiah gets when he is first called to be a prophet. Sort of like somebody was talking about Ezekiel's opening. I don't remember who brought up Ezekiel's vision about a door opening. Somebody did.
Yeah, it's the first chapter,
Oh.
verse 1.
Oh,
Verse
in
1.
Ezekiel, yeah. So
Where he
that's
sees
right. So that's in keeping with this whole apocalyptic revealing of what is hidden, right? Is that God is giving you a special communication. So we'll find these references to the prophets, Daniel in particular, but references to the prophets. So that's pretty clear, I think, reference to Isaiah. And so big picture in the chapter, what's going on? I mean, like, we can pick apart these little, what does 12, what does 4 represent? What do these creatures represent? We can pick apart the symbolism of each of these little things that are going on here. But big picture, what's going on in this chapter is we have a vision of heaven itself. And what's happening in heaven is that we have the one who is on the throne, who is and always will be, and everybody's worshiping that guy, right? The 4 living creatures are constantly, right? Day and night without ceasing, they sing, Holy, 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 the Lord God Almighty, who was and is to come. And then when they do that, that's the cue for the 24 elders on their 24 thrones to also bow down and worship and sing their response and throw down their crowns, right? So, like, you're seeing the highest beings in heaven, and these highest beings in heaven, especially if we add the 7 spirits or 7 archangels, right? You got all the highest beings of the cosmos, and all of them are spending eternity worshiping the one who is on the throne at the center. So, big picture, what's going on in this chapter?
Saying you put it in the context in the class is when you put it in the context of emperor worship and how these people were living. I mean, Christians at that point were seriously persecuted.
Right. Right. So we have just really entered into that era of Christian persecution when Revelation was written. I'm sure I think I put this in one of these earlier study guides, right? But at first the Christians just there weren't enough of them to matter, right? They got to skate by under the radar for a long time. But we have reached a point where there's Christians now in just about every major city in the empire, and they're on the radar, and they're really starting to face some persecution.
Well, and the emperor is God.
Right, and I think we covered that too, but like that.
He said challenge to Roman authority.
Yeah.
Right. So yeah, so this is my last bullet point right here. Images of submission and homage, even among heavenly, spiritual, eternal beings, clearly shows that God is Lord of all the cosmos. Remember the significance to Roman emperor worship. Remember from our introduction, like, Son of God was a title that the emperors had been claiming for themselves for several decades, several generations, by the time Christians start saying Jesus is the Son of God, right?
Sure.
Jesus is Lord. And if Jesus is Lord, it means Caesar ain't. And that's one of the things that we talked about in the introduction, right? Is one of the advantages of you never see apocalyptic literature, well, I shouldn't say never. Apocalyptic literature was not big in the centers of power. It wasn't big among the Romans living in Rome. They talked about themselves, because they saw themselves as being the sort of center of the world, the center of the universe, the great empire, right? One of the functions of apocalyptic literature is that it lets you communicate things in ways that are somewhat coded. It's a way that you can talk about Rome without talking about Rome.
And
So-
the other thing is, this vision is pretty carefully crafted to look way more impressive than even what the palace at Rome would look like.
Oh, sure, right,
So
yeah, I
it's-
mean, we're on
this
the
is
throne in
seriously
heaven before the
impressive,
sea of
yeah.
glass, right? Yeah, it's yeah, lots of radiance, lots of splendor. So I want to make sure that even as we pick apart these small, like, what does this represent, what does this represent, it's also important to pay attention to the big picture of what's going on. What's going on is we have a vision of heaven that clearly communicates to anybody who's paying attention, who's in charge? God's in charge, right? Like, God's the Lord of the cosmos. God is the ruler of all that is and was and is to come.
And there must have been at this time multiple pieces of apocalyptic literature. But this
Yes.
is the one that made the cut.
Yes, and we covered that in one of these earlier ones where I actually listed a number of, yes, so there were a number of pieces of apocalyptic literature that were in Judaism at this time and in Christianity at this time. And there's, of course, some blurriness between those two because we're really only now reaching that point in history where Christianity and Judaism have really started to more firmly and clearly split and separate, right? Because for Jesus was a Jew, his disciples were Jew. You know, at first
Right.
the Jesus movement was a subset of Judaism. It's only at this point in history that we're really starting to see some clearer divisions.
Through what? Revelations and Daniel that made our Bible?
Yeah, so Daniel's our Old Testament apocalyptic literature, and a particular portion of Daniel, not all of Daniel, but yeah, we don't have.
There's a Daniel, I read it this summer, part in the Apocrypha. That's also, well, quite a bit of Apocrypha.
Yeah, there's a lot more of the apocalyptic stuff going on in the Apocrypha.
It's not important.
Yeah, I do not recall a specifically apocalyptic edition of Daniel, but that doesn't mean that it doesn't exist. Because there are a lot of...
Susanna is a version of Daniel.
Oh, okay. Yeah, so we've got, and there was a whole bunch of, yeah, if you look at this one, the Book of Revelations, this first page, like I've listed, Book of Enoch, the Sibylline Oracles, the Assumption of Moses, the Apocalypse of Moses, the Apocalypse of Abraham, the War of the Sons of Light with the Sons of Darkness. Epic tale, like epic title for a story right there, right?
Star Wars.
Right, yeah. I
Lord of the Rings,
I was more Lord of the Rings too, but yeah, I mean, right, yeah, and those were just a few.
What if you take good and bad, good and evil, and take it back? Yeah, some of the Star Wars or Lord of the Rings, they would understand that about as well as we understand Revelations.
Yeah, so I want to make sure, big picture, we're all like, this is what's going. We have a vision of heaven, and God is the Lord of all. So now we're going to jump into chapter number 5. How do we want to? I'm just going to start reading until I decide to stop. How's that sound? Then I saw in the right hand of the one seated on the throne a scroll written on the inside and on the back sealed with 7 seals. So again, there's that number 7. We got the whole completion, perfection, wholeness, divine judgment. And I saw a mighty angel proclaiming with a loud voice, "Who is worthy to open the scroll and break its seals?" And no one in heaven or on earth or under the earth was able to open the scroll or to look into it. And I began to weep bitterly because no one was found worthy to open the scroll or look into it. Then one of the elders, right, so we got 24 elders, said to me, "Do not weep. See, the Lion of the tribe of Judah, the Root of David, has conquered, so that he can open the scroll and its 7 seals." Let's stop there. So who's on the throne? We've established this, but let's...
We assume God's on.
God's on the throne, right? God is on the throne. This should be some pretty clear imagery here. Who is our Lion of Judah and root of David?
Jesus?
Jesus, right? Lion of the tribe of Judah, root of David, right? Because no matter which genealogy you follow, the genealogies could not be more different between Matthew and Luke, but they both agree on one thing, which was that David was Jesus' ancestor, right? That he is descended from the house and the line of David. So Jesus, descendant of the great king of Israel, the Lion of the tribe of Judah, he has conquered so that he can open the scroll and its 7 seals. So what does the scroll and the 7 seals represent?
I wonder if that is that prophecy they're talking about. I will show you what must take place.
I think that's a really good guess. That's basically how I would look at it. This is the scroll that contains God's plan, right? God's like, I got a plan. It's in motion. All right, but here's the thing. The plan cannot unfurl. Right? Good pun right there. The plan cannot unfurl. The scroll cannot unfurl. Come on, people.
I don't know what unfurl even means.
Unfurl, to unroll.
Unroll,
Right,
okay.
yeah, so that's a common
So it
expression. The plan cannot
Unfurl,
unfurl.
it
The-
can't.
And a scroll literally unfurls. Right, so God's plan, who's the key to God's plan?
Jesus.
Jesus is the key to God's plan. This is what we should take away from what we've read so far, right? There's this scroll that represents God's plan and who can open it? It's
It's
Jesus, right? So Jesus is the key to God's whole plan for the world, for salvation, for what God has been working out. Jesus is the key to it. That's what we take away from this, because Jesus alone is worthy to break the seals and unroll the scroll. I also made the note there, this scroll's going to be with us for a while. We're going to be busting seals and reading from the scroll for a while. So
And there's 7 because...
again, probably 7 to represent completion, to represent wholeness, to represent divine judgment, right? So when we have all the seals broken and all the scroll rolled out, then God's plan is done, right? God's plan is fulfilled. So 7 is that number of, here it's serving both to represent completion, right? Here is God's complete plan, right here. God was nice enough to write it down for us and show it to John so that John could tell us what's on it, right? So it's a complete plan. There's also going to be some divine judgment as a part of this, as we will see. Right? And this is important, right? Because we got to remember the historical context. It's not just the historical context of Jesus is Lord, so Caesar is not, in sort of a rebellion against the empire, but that's also reassurance to people who are facing persecution, right? This persecution that we are facing is temporary because the Lord who we serve is the eternal Lord, right? Our persecution is only temporary. Caesar is temporary. Rome is temporary. These things that we are lifting up, that we are putting down as we say Jesus is Lord and Caesar is not, those are just the powers and principalities of this world, and they are temporary. The one we worship is eternal. So, as a part of that, there's going to be some divine judgment, right? There are wicked men who are doing wicked things to God's people. And so, in order for God to set everything right, this is key to, and I know we covered this once in an earlier Bible study, but I'm going to recover it. So, eschatology is your fancy $5 seminary word for how the world ends or how God's plan is finally culminated. And there are basically 2 major different eschatological viewpoints. If you want to spell it, it's eschatology, eschatology. There are basically 2 different eschatological frameworks that the Bible has. One is called the prophetic eschatology. In a prophetic eschatology, basically the preaching of God's word eventually wins over the hearts and minds of everyone, so that eventually everyone just lives as good people in love and harmony and community with one another. Right? God basically convinces us to be the perfect world. That's the prophetic eschatology. The alternative is the apocalyptic eschatology. Guess which one we find in Revelations? And in that one, some people are just going to always be bad people, no matter how much love and word of God is preached to them. And so at some point in history, God finds it necessary to send down some armies of angels with some flaming swords and kick some butts, right? So obviously in Revelations, we're not going to find a prophetic eschatology. That's what the divine judgment is all about in Revelations. It is the assumption that some wicked men are just going to be wicked forever. And in order to set the world right, God's going to have to take them out of the picture. You can decide for yourselves which eschatology you want to adopt in your larger personal belief system. But in Revelation, we're pretty much only going to encounter the apocalyptic eschatology. I like to joke and say that my eschatology shifts depending on what mood I'm in.
Yeah.
Whether I'm feeling particularly optimistic or particularly pessimistic that day.
Or who you want to take it out.
Right. Who has made me upset most recently?
So in that first one, it says the scroll is in the right hand. So is that symbolic of Jesus too?
What's the hand of wickedness?
Probably left. 'cause
Left hand, right? There's a reason why sinister comes from the same root word as left-handedness, sinestro. Yeah, so in one of the things we got to keep in mind, right? Ancient world, people are a little bit superstitious.
Yeah.
Normative, what is true for most of the population is good, and what is true for a minority of the population is bad.
Yeah, we just take them out and stone them.
Left-handed, so this is actually something that I talk about when I give the kids my top 10 coolest Bible verses, right? This is the hand of righteousness, and this is the hand of uncleanliness. This is the clean hand, this is the unclean hand. You touch other people with this hand and only with this hand in ancient Judaism. You never touch somebody with this hand in ancient Judaism. It's verboten, you do not do that. This is if you were born a left-handed person, you learned to make do with your right hand. Hand of cleanliness, hand of uncleanliness. Hand of cleanliness, hand of uncleanliness. Keep in mind, toilet paper has not been invented yet. Hand of cleanliness, hand of uncleanliness.
Oh,
No.
so you would eat with your right hand.
You eat with your right hand, you touch people, literally, hand of cleanliness, hand of uncleanliness. This is what you wipe with. Everybody does. You touch with this, you don't touch with this. Yeah.
Okay, then one other thing is.
So yes, it's going to be in the right hand. It's a holy thing. It will appear in the right hand.
And then how come only one of the 24 elders noted that this was going to be okay?
That's a good question. Why only one says something?
Stop crying.
I don't know. I guess I didn't really read that symbolically. I just read that as somebody needs to take him aside and whisper in his ear, and so they just said one of the 24 did that. I'm not sure if there's a reason for that or
What's your
not.
version?
It says, but one of the 24 elders said to me, stop crying,
What version?
Fine.
Translation.
Translation.
or look. Doesn't your guys say one of the 24?
Yeah, it says one of the 24.
Just
We
curious.
just have do not weep instead of stop crying.
Yes.
sounds a little harsher.
Stop crying, you baby.
Right, that sounds a little harsher. Let's stop crying.
What does the message say?
Okay. Well, anyway, I didn't know if that was symbolic of anything.
It had not registered in my head as something that would be symbolic.
Okay.
That doesn't mean that it's not. It never even caught my attention to ask that question.
See, the Bible don't even say anything about the right hand.
At the very beginning of 5. It must
Oh,
say,
yeah.
I saw a
Right
scroll in the right hand.
Right hand of the one seated. Right hand of God.
So yeah, I mean, that's, right hand is holy, left hand is not holy. So if it's God's plan, it's going to be in the right hand, not in the left.
Okay.
Yeah, I guess I just read that as like taking him aside and giving him the.
Okay.
Yeah. All right. So, should we keep going? Where are we gonna, who wants to read next? Somebody read until I tell you to stop.
Are we at 6?
Verse 6, yeah.
Okay, so I looked and I saw a lamb that had been killed, but was now standing between the throne and the 4 living beings and among the 24 elders. He had 7 horns and 7 eyes, which are the 7 spirits of God and that are sent out into every part of the earth. He stepped forward and took the scroll from the right hand of the one sitting on the throne. And as he took the scroll, the 4 living beings and the 24 elders fell down before the Lamb. Each one had a harp, and they held gold bowls filled with incense, the prayers of God's people. And they sang a new song with these words: "You are worthy to take the scroll and break its seal and open it. For you were killed, and your blood has ransomed people for God from every tribe and language and people and nation. And you have caused them to become God's kingdom and his priests, and they will reign on the earth."
Okay, I'm gonna stop you there. Let's tackle that piece. So, highly symbolic stuff, right? So it's pretty clear, right? We already have 4 living creatures and the elders, right? We've encountered these folks before. We see a lamb standing as if it had been slaughtered, has 7 horns and 7 eyes, right? So clearly lamb is Jesus, right? Lamb that has been slain, right? I mean, we get that clear back in the Gospels. That's a pretty common metaphor for Jesus, the lamb who was slain.
Man turned into the lamb.
Right, our lion is, right, we get lion and lamb all in one. 7 horns and 7 eyes. We are told that these represent, so we're given what these represent. They represent the 7 spirits, which were referred to back in chapter 4, but which we're not 100% sure, are these the 7 archangels, are these the 7 gifts that we find in Isaiah, are these the 7 gifts we find in Romans? Not necessarily clear on that, but whatever those 7 spirits are, that's what the 7 eyes and the 7 horns are representing, we are told. He takes the scroll because he is alone is worthy, right? Nowhere else under heaven and earth was found anyone who was worthy to open the scrolls, but he is, so he gets to take it. And immediately our 4 living creatures and our 24 elders fall down before him and they worship him. We're again kind of given what the symbolism is, right? The incense representing the prayers of the saints, the prayers of God's people on earth, rising up to heaven. And that was a pretty common use of incense. Was the idea was that the incense would carry your prayers up into heaven.
I think it's kind of interesting that they mention God, 7 spirits of God, you're ransomed for God, serving our God, we worship God, but the one on the throne is always the one on the throne, the one who was seated on the throne, never named as God. That just seems odd. I mean, you're supposed to make that leap, I assume.
I don't know.
Yeah, it's, yes.
I don't know if that.
Faith.
Yeah, I don't know if that's. One of the things that pops into my head as you bring that up is that, for instance, the Gospel of Matthew, we find very often that it's the kingdom of heaven, where other Gospels that have the same story, almost word for word, use kingdom of God. And that's because Matthew is our most Jewish gospel writer. He's very Jewish, and his gospel is intended for an explicitly Jewish audience, and so he is an extra step removed, right? Like instead of speaking the name of God, Yahweh, we go to Elohim. He doesn't even want to use Elohim, right? He doesn't even want to use
Well, that's what I was thinking. Well, they must be avoiding it. And then I looked and I thought, well, no, they say God all the time. You were ransomed from God, serving our God. So they say it in one context and not in another. I don't know if they're just trying to be mysterious about who's on the throne or what that is.
And so then the Lamb, Jesus, right, gets the same worship that God on the throne was getting. The 4 living creatures, the 24 elders, all now bow down and worship him and sing a new song, we are told to him, right? You are worthy, for you were slaughtered by your blood, ransomed for God's saints for every child, right? So we get a song of praise now to the Lamb, just like those same beings had been singing praises to God, now they're singing praises to the Lamb. All right. Anything else before I jump? Let me just flip my study guide page, just see if I've missed anything. Oh, right, I did kind of make the connection as I was putting this through here. This idea of a new song representing a new era, which is something that the Christians believe, right? That with Jesus' death and resurrection, the world will never be the same again. We have entered into, in some ways, a new world order after Jesus has been killed and raised from the dead. And we talked at one point in one of our studies about this concept of the already and not yet. You know, that God's plan was accomplished in Jesus, but it was not completed in Jesus, right? So that God's plan has been accomplished through Jesus' life and death and resurrection. But obviously the world is, here we are 2,000 years later, the world's still not a perfect place, right? So that's an important element of Christian theology, is that we live in the already and the not yet. There are very real ways in which we can live into the kingdom of God here and now, in this place, time, in our earthly lives, and at the same time, God's plan for the total salvation of the cosmos has not been completed, right? There is still evil, there is still suffering, there is still pain, there is, right? So I just thought of that as I was reading through this. The new song might represent a new era that we have entered into. So worthy is the Lamb. What makes him worthy? Well, he gets to open the scroll because he's been slaughtered and come back to life and ransomed people for God. And I will just wrap this up here. And I looked and I heard the voice of many angels surrounding the throne and the living creatures and the elders. They numbered myriads and myriads and thousands of thousands. So all of a sudden we got a whole bunch of angels joining the party. We got 4 living creatures, 24 elders, and a buttload of angels. Singing with full voice, worthy is the Lamb that was slaughtered to receive power and wealth and wisdom and might and honor and glory and blessing. Then I heard every creature in heaven and on earth and under the earth and in the sea and all that is in them singing. To the one who is seated on the throne and to the Lamb be blessing and honor and glory and might forever and ever. And the 4 living creatures said, Amen, and the elders fell down and worship. So we're still continuing with this theme of homage, of worship, of praise, and we are now pretty equal in terms of the Lamb and God both getting the worship and the praise. And now we have, everything has joined the song, right? All the angels in heaven are also joining the song. All the living things on the earth are also joining the song. Everybody's joining in, right? So this is ultimate homage, worship, praise that we have going on here, which again, right, keep in mind that connection. If Jesus is Lord, Caesar ain't.
So these millions and millions and millions of angels, are they very much involved in our lives? And there's so many of them. Are they here on earth helping us?
I don't know if you were here when I talked about the letters to the angels, and how I really liked that as a good metaphor. Who is not? Let's just do it again. So one of the things that I talked about when I talked about the interesting thing about the letters being addressed to the angels of the churches rather than the churches. I don't know if you remember that, but in chapters 2 and 3, the 7 letters to the 7 churches were not addressed to the churches themselves, but to the angels of the churches. And I have always thought that that's a really good way to sort of teach this idea of angelic and demonic spiritual forces, right? So when we get together as any organization, any institution, whether it be a church, business, community, state, a nation, right? When we organize ourselves as people, even a family, right? Even your immediate family, Because I'm sure that if you don't have to look very far to find families that are ruled by angelic spiritual forces and families that are ruled by demonic spiritual forces, right? When we get together as people, there is a sense in which we are more as a whole than we are as the individual sum of its parts. Right? You have probably had experiences where you have gone into met a new group of people for the first time and you're just like, man, these are some warm, wonderful, caring people. I'm getting good vibes here. Like entering this space, I am picking up good vibrations. Like I can sense that there's something good and healthy going on in this space and among these people. And then you've probably also had the opposite experience, right? Where, and I mean, not even just groups of people, even individuals, right? Like that's what, like you probably had that gut reaction, like you meet somebody and you're just like, I don't know what it was, this person never said anything or did anything inappropriate, but there's this weird kind of uncomfortable feeling that I get around this person, right? There is more than meets the eye, to quote the Transformers, right? In our world, there is, and this is what I believe, is that there's sort of a spiritual element to the world that we inhabit. It is not something that is readily seen and touched in the way that the material universe is, but it very much affects our present realities and lives. So I have always found angels as creatures in white robes with great big feathery wings, and demons with their cloven hooves and their little horns and forked tails and forked tongues. I don't find that, like, that's just a way to depict an invisible thing, right? That's not a helpful, I don't think that there are angels and devils in that sense, that these are, right? I mean, that's the whole point, is these are spiritual beings, not physical beings. We're not talking about an embodied being, right? We're not talking about an embodied force. Maybe even being. I'm not even sure if they are beings in the sense that
Do not be afraid.
right. I'm not even sure if they are beings in the sense that we would use that term, like as in having a mind and self-determination in the world thereof. Maybe they are. I don't know. What I do know is that there are spiritual forces at play in our lives that often go unseen, but very much, like, it's a thing, it's a reality, right? Like, there are people, I mean, talk to somebody as they're hitting rock bottom and, like, they are using drugs and they're out on the streets and they're stealing from people, even people that they care about, stealing from their own family in order to feed their, like, there's some demonic spiritual forces at work, right? When you go into those organizations, like, I mean, which one was it? Was it Uber or Lyft? I think it was Uber, right? That was like, all of a sudden in the news with all this corporate culture of like sexual harassment and sexual assault happening at the highest levels of their organization, to the point that the CEO had to step down because he was accused of sexual assault, and just perpetuating and permitting this culture to spread, right? Cultures spread in organizations. And I think that's a really important thing to point out when we talk about like the spirit of collective organizations. Like, you can enter into a really unhealthy system as a healthy person and find pretty quickly that you start adopting the unhealthy behaviors of the unhealthy system that you have entered into, and vice versa.
Like cults.
Like cults, yeah. I mean, we could. There's so many examples of unhealthy cultures popping into my head right now. We need to move on. But so to answer your question, yes, I absolutely believe in what I like to refer to as angelic and demonic spiritual forces. That is to say, spiritual energies that encourage goodness and love and compassion and cooperation, and spiritual energies that are selfish and self-centered and cruel and right. And I think that that's a reality. I think that, I mean, this is part of what it is for me to be a Christian, to be a spiritual person, to be a religious person, is I am very scientific and rationally minded, and I do believe in the empirical evidence that my eyes present to me. I just don't think that the empirical evidence that my eyes present to me is the 100% complete picture of the world and reality that we inhabit. So, all right, yeah. So, chapter 6. Let's try to knock this out before 7 and we'll get going. All right, here we are. We're really getting into it now. Do we need to end at 6:30? I'm okay with ending at 6:30. I'm okay with going until 7. I'm not going to go past 7. Okay, then we can be actually done with this particular study. So we start opening some seals. Then I saw the Lamb open one of the 7 seals. There it goes. First seal's open. And I heard one of the 4 living creatures call out as with a loud voice of thunder. I looked, and there was a white horse. Its rider had a bow. A crown was given to him, and he came out conquering and to conquer. When he opened the second seal, I heard the second living creature call out, "Come!" And out came another horse, bright red. Its rider was permitted to take peace from the earth, so that people would slaughter one another, and he was given a great sword. When he opened the third seal, I heard the third living creature call out, "Come!" I looked, and there was a black horse. Its rider held a pair of scales in its hand, and I heard what seemed to be a voice in the midst of the 4 living creatures saying, "A quart of wheat for a day's pay, and 3 quarts of barley for a day's pay. But do not damage the olive oil and the wine." When he opened the 4th seal, I heard the voice of the 4th living creature call out, "Come!" I looked, and there was a pale green horse. Its rider's name was Death, and Hades followed with him. They were given authority over a fourth of the earth to kill with sword, famine, and pestilence, and by wild animals of the earth. Let's stop there. The famous, the infamous 4 horsemen of the apocalypse. There they are.
I didn't realize they were colored.
We have colored horses. Each horse gets its own color. Each rider gets its own accoutrements, its devices, its tools. All right. So big picture, the what they represent is really quite clear, I think, right? The first one, we have a conqueror, right? He's got a crown. He came out conquering and to conquer, right? So we have somebody who is who's conquering countries, nations, cities, out there conquering. Our second one, again, we have a pretty clear the removal of peace and the influence of war, right? Peace is gone, war has come. The third one, maybe a little bit trickier, only if you don't know that we're getting ripped off for our food prices here. Scales, right? He has scales, and he's how much is it going to cost you to buy? Like, he's weighing out on his scales food, and it's costing you an arm and a leg to buy food. So he is our famine, right? Because it's costing you a full day's pay to get a tiny little bit of grain. And then with the 4th seal, we actually have the explicit name of Death. Hades follows him, and he kills a quarter of the earth with sword, famine, pestilence, and wild. So this is all, check all of the above for how he's going to kill you, right? Nothing's off the table. We got famine and pestilence and the sword, right? So he's killing with all the things that were the problems before. Okay.
But isn't that just kind of light?
Sure.
It's been going on since creation.
So that's a very good point, Michelle, and that's a really interesting part of the reason why this is so difficult for us to. So what the big picture symbol is clear, right? We've got conquest, we've got war, we've got famine, we've got death. What specifically does John, the author of Revelation, want us to think of when we think of conquest in history? It's hard to say. Because like I said, conquest has been going on forever, right? War has been going on forever. Are we talking about a war that happened in the 1st and 2nd centuries? Probably 2nd at this point, because we've been told that this is future events. So but is this like near future for John? Is this stuff that he expects to play out in his lifetime? Is this stuff that happens at some later point in history, like is war, are we talking about World War I or World War II? Or is war supposed to represent some great far-off future event that hasn't happened yet? Right? We also covered in one of these study guides that there are different frameworks for reading Revelations. You know, there's that dispensationalist approach that says that this is all end of the world stuff, none of it has happened yet, right? None of this stuff has anything to do with 2nd century Palestine, and it has everything to do with some future event that's going to happen. And there are also scholars who will say, no, he was trying to make predictions that he expected to come to fruition in the next generation or two. He was looking at specific nations and people that are out there on the horizon and saying, hey, that country over there is starting to get strong and powerful and stir up trouble. Maybe they'll actually be able to take on Rome at some point. It totally depends on your framework. So I've just kind of listed out here. It's like, what could these represent? If you're reading the Left Behind series, this is the first appearance of the Antichrist. The conqueror is. If you're part of that premillennial dispensationalist, this is what marks the beginning of the end of the world. These are events that haven't happened yet. This is the Antichrist, that's why he's conquering, right? He becomes the revered leader of the globe. He becomes the respected global leader in that framework. We could have the conqueror be Rome itself. That he's like, this is such short-term future, that what we're talking about here is Rome itself, that Rome will continue its path of conquest in at least the immediate future. Maybe that's what John is trying to tell us. Maybe it represents, on the other hand, the enemies of Rome. Maybe these are the people that finally managed to start conquering some of Rome's territory. There is not really a clear answer. Another one, if you want to flip ahead to Revelations 19, 11 through 13, says that I saw heaven open. So we're getting a little out of order, but it's important to point this out. Then I saw heaven open, and there was a white horse. Its rider is called Faithful and True, and in righteousness he judges and makes war. His eyes are like a flame of fire, and on his head are many diadems. And he has a name inscribed that no one knows but himself. He is clothed in a white robe dipped in blood, and his name is called the Word of God. So maybe, right, so here we have another rider on a white horse wearing crowns. Maybe this first seal, this first rider represents the gospel of Jesus Christ. Represents the Word of God itself, the gospel itself. I'm kind of inclined to that approach just because it's the one that's most cohesive with the rest of the text, right? Because then that makes that connection to chapter 19 clearer. If you were to press me which one I think it is, that's what I'd go with. I'd go with the gospel of Jesus Christ starts conquering, right? And that makes a lot of sense also in historical context, because remember, John is living at that place where what once was this little fringe movement of a tiny number of people in Jerusalem that were, now it has spread to basically every corner of the Roman Empire. Every major city in the empire now has a Christian church in it. So that'd be my guess, but it really depends. There is not a right answer here. If you want to say that it's Rome itself, you could make that argument and make it a good one. If you want to say it's the enemies of Rome, you can make that argument and you can make it a good one. If you want to project this into the future and say that this is something that hasn't happened yet, you make that argument, right? These are all plausible. What does the writer actually represent, right? Clearly conquest. That's the no-brainer. But whose conquest? That's the question mark.
What color green do you have? Is there a reason for these colors? I mean, I assume the red is blood because...
Have you seen what corpses look like before the advent of embalming fluid?
No, I really haven't. Okay. All right.
Yeah, there's a
So
there's
it's like rot and decay.
right. It is the color of dead flesh.
Okay.
We don't get to see that much anymore because we get them embalmed and get some makeup on them, and if left to their own devices, you're gonna start to see the whole, like, I mean, so bruise, right? Picture bruise
Okay.
all over. So, second horseman, again, the pretty obvious war. Taking peace from the earth, I thought was a really important thing to point out, that word peace was very significant in the Roman imperial system. The whole point of the emperor was to guarantee what they called the Pax Romana, the peace of Rome. That was the Latin word, Pax Romana, the peace of Rome. And the way that the Roman emperor guaranteed the peace of Rome was to wage war. The peace of the Romans was assured because they had a territory extending hundreds, even thousands of miles around them. That was their buffer zone, right? If you live in Rome proper, nobody's going to touch you. They have to come through country after country after country that you have conquered, that you control, that you have troops stationed in, that is feeding your taxes, right? It's empire. It is very much a pyramid scheme, right? We take from everybody, and all of the, you can just kind of picture like a bullseye, right? Like, the further out you go, the rawer end of this deal you get. And if you're right here in Rome, pretty sweet setup for you. Because you're getting the wealth of all the nations and all the people, all the slaves from all these countries around you. The closer you get to the center of power, the better off you are. It's pyramid scheme.
Legions were
Right.
Romans. The legions were Italian.
Right.
The legions were conquered.
Right. And they were a little bit closer into the middle by virtue of them being Roman soldiers. They're a little bit closer to the center than the guys on the outside, and that works for them, right? I mean, yeah, we're doing the work of the people who conquered us, but we got it better than the guys we're conquering now. Like, pyramid scheme, very much pyramid scheme. So that's important, right? Take away peace from the earth means the end of our, I would suggest probably is a reference to, in some way, an end to the Pax Romana. I think that's at least worth doing. So we got war, and warfare and bloodshed. Again, is this Rome, Roman? Are the Romans doing the war, or are they having the war brought to them? Is it for or against war? Is it civil war? Turns out that the Pax Romana does end about 100 years after the writing of Revelations, as the empire starts its crumble and decay. Does it refer to the persecution of Christians? No. Similarly, the third seal, right? Clearly represents famine. You could also make the argument that it represents persecution because there are scales, and often scales represent justice. My guess is that's not what they're intended to represent here, just because I think they're in reference to the pay for food, because you weigh out the food and the payment. But that's often when you see symbols of scales, justice is what they're, right? I mean, Lady Justice with the blindfold and the scales, right? That's a pretty common symbol for justice. It's also worth pointing out that he's predicting a shorter famine than a longer famine, because it's the annuals that are so expensive, right? Your annual crops, your barley and your wheat are planted annually. Your vineyards and your olive groves are not annuals. These are established plants that last for a long time. So that's probably an indication that the prediction for famine is a prediction for a short-term famine rather than a long-term famine. And then we have our fourth rider, pale green horse. He is death, with a capital D. Hell right behind him, yep. What does he represent? Death. Pestilence and plague. The word plague and the word death in the Greek language are very, very similar and share a common root. There are only about 2 letters difference between those two words. So what does it represent? Could we be talking about at this point the destruction of the Roman Empire? Hard to say. So, like I put in here, check in, like depending on what you depending on your framework, if you're a preterist, if you're one of those people who thinks that John is writing about the events that are going to be taking place in his lifetime in the next couple of generations in the immediate future, then this kind of makes some sense. Maybe the conquest and the war represent the Parthians, who are the first people who are going to give Rome a run for its money here in the near term. There's also going to be increasing warfare and civil war and strife among the folks as the empire does start to crumble. There was a Roman emperor who instituted a policy encouraging Romans to cut down some vineyards and plant more grain to help to feed his growing armies, a policy that turned out to be very unpopular, because, right, that upends the pyramid scheme. If we're Romans, we should get wine. Our job is not to feed your troops. Your troops' job is to feed us. And there was a plague that took place, around this time. So these could all be events that were happening right around that time. If you're a historicist, that you think that these events will take place at some point in the future. We do have the fall of Rome. If you're millennial or futurist, right, then these are end times prophecies that haven't happened yet. These refer to some great famine that still lies on our horizon. This refers to some great, World War III or something like that still lies on our horizon. And there are at least a few people who have made the argument that all these are the same writer, and they're all Jesus. Different aspects of that. And that sort of is one way that you can interpret, especially if you go with the first writer being the gospel itself. It depends on your framework, how you want to. The symbols are fairly easy to decode, right? And this is we're going to stop here. We'll jump in here the next time we get together. But I wanted to point this out because this is the part of Revelations that nobody knows for certain. Don't let them tell you that they do. It is fairly easy for us to decode the symbols. Right? First one's conquest, second one's war, third one's famine, fourth one's death. But what specific conquest in history, what specific war in history, right? Whose conquest, whose war? It's just not obvious. I cannot tell you a definitive answer. I've kind of got my own take on each one of these things, but it could just as easily be one of the other things that I listed as an option in the study guide, right? I'm kind of inclined to think the conqueror is the gospel, because I'm a big believer in cohesiveness within the text itself. That's not true when you're jumping between different books of the Bible, especially books that were written by different people over long distances in history apart. But right, like when we read Luke, I look to Acts to give me clues as to what Luke meant and vice versa, because we're pretty clear that those were written by the same person. When it's all coming from the same book of the Bible, cohesiveness within the text is something that I tend to pay attention to and favor as I interpret. So if you were to ask me who's the conqueror, I think that John is referring to the conquest of the gospel. He's pointing to the way that the gospel has spread so much in the last couple of generations, and his belief that it will continue to spread as it has been spreading. So in my mind, it's a very, very short-term prediction that John is making based on the very real history that he is looking at, seeing how the gospel has spread so successfully throughout the empire. That'd be my take. But you could easily say, nope, that's the Parthians. And there are people who will agree with you. You could say it's the Antichrist, and the movie starring Kirk Cameron. And there are people who will agree with you. There is not a definitive, this is what this means answer to this. That's the beauty of apocalyptic literature. We get to write in code. That's the downside of apocalyptic literature, right? We put that from the outset. If you want some real clear, do this and don't do this, read the Ten Commandments, read the Sermon on the Mount. I think it's really very straightforward sets of instructions.
Before we go, could you
Sure.
take a look at 11, verse 11? I don't think that's in quote. That's pretty clear.
Yeah, so, yes, that's also pretty clear, right? White robes.
Your white robes, but some of you are gonna die.
Yeah. So the martyrdom is gonna be, the second half of the chapter that we did not get to is gonna have a lot to do with martyrdom. I'm gonna remind you that martyrdom is one of the major themes. Remember, keep referring back to this page with all the major themes and motifs, and I'm sure I put, witness, testimony, martyr. All share the same root word in Greek. And it is a major theme in Revelations that is going to be coming up. We are bearing witness, we are giving testimony, some of us are going to be killed for it. This is the historical context in which John operates. The persecution of the Christian church has begun. They're a big enough deal now. And by the way, for those of you who are interested, anybody know the historical reason, the main driving factor why they were so persecuted? There's two reasons. The first one was a reason why the Jews were also not real well liked, which is just the refusal to entertain emperor worship, right? Christians, like their Jewish ancestors, are strict monotheists. They will not worship idols, they will not bow down to Caesar. That right there makes them unpopular. But why Christians get it especially, because they get it even worse than the Jews in the Roman Empire. The reason why the Christians are extremely persecuted is because they take Jesus' commandment to love your enemies, pray for those who persecute you, and turn the other cheek so seriously that they refuse Roman military service. That has some pretty major implications for the Pax Romana. It wasn't until around 300 AD, Augustine and those boys, that we started opening up that door a little bit. And of course, now Christians serve in military at pretty much the same rate as anybody else does. But the early Christian church was so committed to nonviolence that they refused to serve in the Roman military. That is a religion that Rome wants to quash. Don't go around preaching that nonsense. Yeah, so they got all the same things that the Jews do, which already made them pretty unpopular. Not worshiping Caesar, not worshiping the Roman idols. And they're still a minority group, which makes them an easy scapegoat. But that is the thing that will really put the Christians under the microscope and under the knife in the Roman Empire. That's why they face the toughest persecutions of any religious group until all of that starts to break down with some of the later church fathers stuff. That starts with, it's okay to go to war if it's to defend your neighbor. Even for those first church fathers that opened that door, it was not okay for you to kill in self-defense. It was okay for you to kill in defense of your neighbor. And then from there, self-defense, and then from there. And then, of course, we also get Constantine and his vision of, in this sign, conquer, and he becomes the conquering Roman emperor who is also a Christian. That it doesn't stick around, right? Just like we did that Bible study about the role of women in the church and the role of slaves in the early church, and how it doesn't take too long before the wider societal values infiltrate the early church. It won't take long before that happens. But at least for the first couple of centuries of the history of the Christian church, they were so committed to nonviolence that they refused to serve in the Roman military. And that is what gets them the real persecution, that others get persecuted, but nobody gets it like the Christians. And that's why. Because anybody who becomes a Christian won't enlist, won't go off and conquer foreign lands to bring their treasures back to Rome.